legal proceedings against them, but they nonetheless are becoming creditors within a business practice. We can also divide creditors between strong creditors and weak creditors, and really strong creditors include those that have a stronger position within the business, maybe have stronger leverage within the business. For example, banks and other lenders will tend to have a stronger position within a business because they have provided a certain amount of, and the sole tradership that exists wouldn't exist anymore because it's directly connected to the person operating the trades. It's also, companies are also heavily regulated through a number of pieces of legislation. We've already mentioned them, a number of them here today. We've got mainly the Companies Act 2006, we have the Insolvency Act 1986 for if a company becomes insolvent, and we also have things like when we're referring to non-maximise, if we're talking about portfolio investments specifically. Employees as well, they have interests within business structures because they are relying on the business to pay them a particular wage for particular work, for particular labour. And other different, maybe more smaller, different stakeholders, people like tax authorities. So taxes are interested in making sure businesses pay the amount of tax that they owe. And so really we can, in countries like England and the Netherlands, we've got, for example, one of the most famous and arguably the largest was the East India Company that spanned across the empire. And the point of these companies, the point in turning your business into a company is to be able to build on and expand business practices and do more business effectively. So contractual liabilities of a company, things like the Corporate Manslaughter Act, and you've also got regulation from supranational institutions like the European Union, mainly EU directives, and a few pieces of EU case law as well from the ECJ, and obviously we have to talk about the impact of Brexit on company law. And then you've also got a number of international law regulations that seem to act as sometimes more of a guide forms. So we're going to look at what the kind of business forms we can have and what they're useful for and what they're not useful for in some cases. Because there is a difference between company law and there's a difference between that and business law. Because company is a form of business, it's a business structure, but it isn't the only form of business structure that exists. So what's the first question? The first question is, what is a company? And it's really a good place to corporate insolvency and bankruptcy law in this series of videos, but what I want to do specifically is focus on them in more detail in their own series of lessons, because technically corporate insolvency law is different to company law. It relates to business practices and it relates to companies, but corporate insolvency is a very specific environment that takes place after a number of things happen, and the main one being to how company laws should be regulated within particular states. The type of business structure I want to use legally to operate my business, then I have to really ask myself three questions. The first is, will the chosen business form facilitate the raising of required capital for the particular business? Or in other words, will the business form, will it meet the capital requirements? Because for some businesses, it requires the creation and the raising of capital and paid using personal wealth. On the other hand, we have a partnership, and it's really the 1890 Partnership Act that identifies really what a partnership is, and it says, I'm just going to read it word for word, that the relationship which subsists between persons carrying a business in common with the view of profit. This is what a partnership is. And really, a partnership will often be regulated by way of contractual obligations. And just like with a sole trader, there is no protection from the debts to creditors if a business fails. However, unlike with a sole trader, the liability to the creditors would be shared across however many people the partnership itself. So finally, let's look at the main one we want to talk about, and this is a company. Now, a company exists as a separate legal entity with another individual with the intention to carry on business with the common view of profit. Then it's that contract that will generally regulate the partnership and will be the source of operations for how the partnership works. And therefore, if you enter into some kind of contractual obligations or enter into some kind of relationship with the view of doing business for a profit, you become de facto partners, and that becomes a de facto partnership. Come to a near endless list of different kinds of stakeholders that we can identify within a business. But how would we identify the different types of stakeholders? And this is why we look at things like creditors. Now, a creditor is simply somebody or an entity who has entered into business with a company. So this can be either voluntarily or involuntarily, meaning that a debtor cannot pay its debts to a creditor, and that's where insolvency proceedings begin to take shape. So it's important that we do focus on that in a lot more detail in its own separate lessons, but we will touch on it very briefly in this series of videos as well. And it should also be noted that we are going to be limiting our understanding and our study to UK related company laws. There are obviously other branches of company law that exist. We could talk about EU company law, we could talk land law or law of tort, where there are obviously lots of changes that take place, but the base structure and the basic principles tend to remain pretty much the same for a long period of time. Company law is very different. Company law changes a lot, and especially when it comes to the implication that different constitutional reforms has on the business world and on business practices. A very good example of that is Brexit. We also talk about international company law, and while they will play a role, obviously the EU is going to have play a major role when we're talking about different ways in which company law operates in the UK, we're not going to focus on them specifically. So let's begin to talk about companies themselves. So that's the sort of housekeeping done and out of the way. Let's talk about specifically what we are talking about with companies. And we're going to begin by looking at what are the different kinds of corporate manslaughter as well. You also have the various people that own some kind of shares in a particular business, or just some kind of interest in terms of investing within the business, owning the business, or being partners within a business. And so these people obviously have a stake in seeing the company or the business do very well, because they want to see their profits split. And these are secured and unsecured creditors. Now, this is a little bit more complicated, but a secured creditor are ones who are associated with an issuance of credit or product that is backed by a certain amount of collateral. Now, it's better probably to use some examples. So, they generally refer to voluntary creditors, people who voluntarily enter into some kind of relationship with the business. It's very important and key to ensuring its survival. So, really there are three that we're going to talk about, three business structures that we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on the concept of the sole trader or the sole proprietor, the concept of a partnership, and then finally the concept of a company. And we're going to distinguish what all of these different things mean. So, sole traders or sole proprietorship is really the most informal form of business. And that might be the case, but not all business structures are geared towards capital, raising of capital and creation of profit. The second question you want to be asking is, what are the risks associated with a particular business form? Specifically, what happens if a particular business fails? In some cases, there are limited liabilities where a debtor this can be on the one hand a secured interest, which we'll talk about in a little minute, and it could also be an unsecured interest. It could be an interest that is a strong interest and a weaker interest. And you can probably pick and choose which ones fall into the sort of strong and weak distinction when we go through this list. So one such stakeholders in a company or a business are lenders, and these are the people that maybe provide the capital requires, where a debtor has less liability to pay off the debts of the particular business, but in some cases the debts may have to be paid out using personal finances. And so you have to really ask yourself, what are the risks associated with this business structure? And the final question you would ask is, does this business form provide for the most efficient organizational structure? Because organizing a business is, I have an interest in that business because I am, interacting and forming contractual obligations with that business by way of purchasing an item from a shop. You could also talk about tort and crime victims, so people who have been wronged by the business will have an interest in seeing that come to some kind of justice, whether that be a tort or whether that be a crime, a criminal procedure. We'll talk about, and it exists separately from the people who are running the business, and that's why, unlike with partnership and sole traders, the people who run and operate a company may come and go over a period of time, whereas the company will stay the same. You cannot say the same for a sole trader or a partnership. If somebody decides to retire from a partnership, or if they're a sole trader and they decide to retire, and obviously you can probably imagine the implication of Brexit on overseas companies operating within the UK. So the first major reform that we're going to talk about is the reform to the 1985 Companies Act, and this was a real major overhaul of this piece of legislation, and also it came with it the passage of a new piece of legislation, the Companies Act 2006, which came into force in 2000. Lenders, managers, investors, for example, and it really means that they can seek securities from the business, okay? Whereby if their interests or their issuance of a credit product are unable to be secured, then the business then there is a certain consequence from the business, and that is in the form of securities. By contrast, on the other side of the coin, when we're talking about company law, and really the concept of a company is simply that it is an abstract entity. It is a legal fiction, if you will, okay? It is just a legal entity which we utilize to do business and operate business in a particular way. Our modern understanding of the company, the sort of modern interpretation of companies that really hasn't changed that much, since the 16th century began. What I want to do in this lesson is introduce the concept of company law. We're going to look at a number of very basic key elements of company law. We're going to be exploring what the concept of company law is. We're going to be looking at the modern evolution of companies. So we're going to look a little bit about the history and where companies originated, the time periods where they became more and more prominent. We're going to mainly focus on the modern. Now, we will be referencing the Companies Act a lot throughout this series of lessons, obviously, but the Companies Act itself is particularly huge. It's a very, very, very big, thick, dense piece of legislation. So I wouldn't encourage anybody to read it from start to finish, but we will be referencing all the important parts throughout. And then in 2015, we have a reform to small business, and with the small business enterprise, an unsecured creditor is one that doesn't have any collateral within its crediting when it acts as a creditor with a business. And really, in other words, effectively, a secured creditor holds a line on its debtor's property. Now, we're going to talk about this in a later lesson, so don't worry about not understanding it too much yet. But the distinction between secured and unsecured creditors generally is probably the most complex of the different ways in which we can distinguish creditors in business interests that you can have in a company. And in fact, not just a company, in business structures in general. So this refers to business stakeholders. Okay? So like I've just said there, it could be a company or it could be any other kind of business form. And we're going to talk about the business forms in a minute. So the different stakeholders. A stakeholder is simply somebody or an entity who has some kind of interest in the company. And this can be is that there are no protections if this particular business fails. So if you accrue debts throughout the operation of your business, which is something that generally happens all the time, it's a natural part of business, you accrue debts. Well then, if you are unable to pay said debts, you cannot have those debts written off in the form of bankruptcy proceedings. You'd have to pay that out yourself. So debts to creditors would have to be used capital, and that is then owed back to the banks, usually at an increased rate with interest. On the other hand, you have people like customers who tend to be weaker creditors. They have less of a position within the business. They're not as integrated within the business if you're simply just purchasing a good or service from the business. And then we've got the final way in which we characterize credit requirements for the business to take shape. And a very good example of that would maybe be a bank. A bank often offers business loans to individuals who are wishing to start a business, and these are the people that infuse the business with a certain amount of capital to be able to get off the ground. You also have customers and clients. So if I go and walk into a shop, I'm going to purchase an item from a shop. So it's again it's a very informal way of operating business practices in the United Kingdom. It's very similar to a sole trader, except in the sense that there are more than one of you. But at the same time, there is no need for incorporation or anything like that. And like it says here, a partnership may be regulated using contractual obligations. So for example, if you enter into a contract, and this doesn't necessarily have to be a written contract, okay? With that being said, let's look at business forms, different business structures that exist in the UK, specifically 3 main ones, and then we'll refer to really the pros and cons of each one. So really, this doesn't necessarily have to refer to a company. In fact, spoiler alert, a company is one of the business forms. The other 2 do not exist as a company, and we'll distinguish between what makes a company and what makes it not a company later on. So really, each business form operates in a certain way for a particular purpose. Now, they're generally tailored towards different types of business operations that people might want to partake in. So there are a number of factors that contribute to somebody choosing a particular business form. So if I want to start a business, okay, and I want to try and pick when it comes to the specifically the legislative evolution of company law, it should be noted that there've been quite a few interesting changes in very recent years, and by very recent I mean literally last year. So really, we're talking about since 2006, because it's important that we look at the sort of modern evolution of company law, because company law changes quite a lot. It's not like structure. It does not require any formal registration. There is no need for any kind of incorporation of the business structure. There is no formal business structure that is required. It is simply how, if you want to start a business, this is the most simple way to do it. The majority of business forms that exist in the UK are sole traders. I believe it's around 65%. Modern legislative evolution of companies, namely since the Companies Act 2006. Then we're going to look at what it means to be a stakeholder in a company, what different kinds of stakeholders there are, and then from that we're going to build upon the concept of business creditors, have a look at the different types of creditors, the distinction between, for example, a secured and an unsecured creditor, so on and so forth, before we finish up by looking at different business. And an example of a voluntary creditor would be something like a lender in a bank. So a lender in a bank voluntarily provides a certain amount of capital for the particular business. An involuntary creditor could be something like, in the case of tort and crime victims, these people don't intend to enter into some kind of relationship with the business when they are, entering an Employment Act 2015. Then we start to see the larger reforms that took place, specifically in response to particularly the COVID-19 pandemic. So one example of this is the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act from 2020. And this act provides new mechanisms and new methods for a company to restructure, and also for company rescue and company recovery. Now, we will be talking about, and they're mainly used for very small businesses, sometimes referred to as micro businesses. And these are generally, if you are, for example, a plumber, and you are a single, self-employed, you work on your own, you tend to be a sole trader, because there is, less need for a larger business structure when you're a one-person operating and doing business around the country, for example. One consequence of a sole trader from the particular individual or individuals who are establishing it. So it means in order for a company to exist, there has to be a process of incorporation, and this process is a way in which a company exists legally as its own separate person within law. In the UK, this is done at Companies House, and so a company is really a business form that has undergone the process of incorporation.